Mrs. Neera Sharma is going to explain the chapter A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot from your class 10th English book Footprints Without Feet. This is our first chapter. Now let us read about the author. James Alfred White, known by the pen name James Herriot, was a British veterinary surgeon and writer who used his many years of experiences as a veterinary surgeon to write a series of books, each consisting of stories about animals and their owners. Now, he's best known for semi autobiographical works. Now, before we read the story, let me give you a brief introduction about the chapter. The chapter is about a small dog, Tricky, who is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. Now, Tricky falls seriously ill, and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does the surgeon perform an operation or does the dog recover? This is what we are going to read in the story. The story has a beautiful message, which I am going to discuss with you in the end. Let us read the story. Meanings of some difficult words are given on the right hand side on the slides. I was really worried about Tricky this time. Who is I? I is the narrator. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. Now, why was the narrator shocked to see the dog? Because the dog was hugely fat, and he was hugely fat like a bloated sausage. That is, he was excessive in size, with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. All these lines describe you the condition of the dog, as you can also see in the picture below. He had red eyes, and the eyes were also watery, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So this was the condition of the dog, and the writer saw the dog. He was walking with his mistress. Well, the name of the mistress is Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. Now, Mr. Herriot is the narrator, and he here is referred to the dog, Tricky. He seemed to have no energy. That is, the dog was lacking enthusiasm. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. That is, I think, lacking proper nutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. So along with the meals, regular meals, the dog was being given extras. That is, what were the extra things given to him? Some malt and a cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So according to the mistress, this was nothing much really. And the narrator asks, and did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? This line tells us that the author had also already spoken to the mistress earlier also about the condition of the dog. He must have advised her to cut down on the sweet things. Oh, I did for a bit, Mrs. Pumphrey replied, but he seemed to be so weak. I had to relent, that I had to agree to his demands. I had to listen to his demands because he seemed to be so weak. He does love ice cream cakes and chocolates. He loves cream cakes and chocolates, and so I can't bear to refuse him. So what does this tell us? This tells us that Mrs. Pumphrey pampers the dog a lot. I looked down again at the little dog. Who is this I again? Is the narrator. That was the trouble. So, what was the trouble according to the doctor? According to the doctor, the trouble was over pampering of Mrs. Pumphrey. Okay, over pampering of the dog by Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. He was thinking that, there must be many things which Mrs. Pumphrey has not mentioned also. And are you giving him plenty of exercise? Now, overfeeding was done, but was enough exercise given? So, well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, But Hawkins, the gardener, had been down with lumbago. What is lumbago? Muscle pain, muscular pain. So there has been no ring throwing lately. That means the gardener is not well. He's suffering from muscular pain. And that is the reason, he's not able to give him exercise. And he now these days the dog is only having regular walks with Mrs. Pumphrey. I tried to sound severe. Okay, he started talking in a serious tone. Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. This is the advice the doctor gives Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult, because she cannot refuse the dog whenever he, wants food. So she sets off, head down along the road, as if determined to put a new regime into practice immediately. She is trying to make up her mind that from now on she's not going to overfeed the dog. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He was moving in a very unsteady manner. And what was he wearing? His little tweed coat. You can see in the picture also. And he had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. What is a harness? It is the strap and the fittings that the dog was wearing at that time. And this the raincoat and the all weather coats that the dog was wearing at that time, they all tell us how the dog was pampered by the owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. He was expecting a call from Mrs. Pumphrey because he was very sure that the dog would be seriously ill and he would be getting a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught, very much worried and upset. Tricky would eat nothing. This was the condition of the dog now. Refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He had, rounds of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. The dog's condition was because of overeating. I had made my plans in advance. The veterinary doctor knew that this was going to happen, so he had made up his plans. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. Now, the doctor suggested to Mrs. Pumphrey that it would be good to get Tricky hospitalized and to keep him under observation for about 15 days. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Pumphrey nearly fainted. She was sure that if Tricky did not see her every day, he would surely die. But the narrator kept his words. He told her that this was the only option, as Tricky was really very ill. The doctor thought that it would be best to avoid any delays and get him to the hospital as soon as possible. He went to their house, and even though Mrs. Pumphrey was crying, she was wailing because she did not want her dog to go away from her. He took the dog, wrapped it in a blanket, and put him in the car. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, his favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Now, the maids were then woken up and asked to get out all of Tricky's stuff. Which all stuffs? His stuff included the things like his day bed, his night bed, his favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast, lunch, and snack bowls. Mr. Harriet knew that so much stuff won't fit in his car, so he started rushing in his car. And as the doctor was leaving with Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey threw a lot of coats that Tricky used to wear in his car. As the narrator was turning the car, on the turn he saw through the rear mirror that everybody was in tears. Everybody was crying because of the going away of Tricky. On the road, I glanced upon the a pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. Now he patted the little helpless animal, who responded by wagging his tail. The narrator then thought and told Tricky that he knew that Tricky did not have any energy, but he surely had the way to get him better. As soon as this reached the hospital, all the other dogs gathered around the doctor. Tricky looked at all of them, and when the doctor put him down on the carpet, he couldn't even move. The other dogs then sniffed him and thought to themselves that he was a very uninteresting object and that there was no use standing there, and they ignored him and they left him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For the next 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. Now that the dog was at his disposal, he had made up his plans to make the dog better. What did the narrator do? The narrator made the bed for Tricky in a warm box along with the other dogs. For 2 days, the narrator kept him just on water and did not give him anything else. On the second day, then, he roamed around looking at the place around him, and on the third day, he was also making noise to let the people in the hospital know that he too wanted to go out with the other dogs. These were the changes that could be felt in Tricky. When the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was a greyhound, and his friends. Okay. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs started inspecting Tricky. The dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat, with his extra fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding table. I watched. Now, what did he watch? When everybody had, again after sniffing the dog, this Tricky, for a moment, all the dogs, they followed. They left for the garden where Tricky also started following them. This was the change that could be felt in Tricky. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dining table, and what did he see? Especially Tristan. As he was slopping the food, all of them were eating with great speed because they knew that if they didn't finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing his meal, would come and eat their meal. This was their practice. So what happened then? When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls. Why were the bowls shining? Because they had they had licked even the last bit of food. And what did Tricky do? He started licking casually inside one or two of them. So that means that Tricky had started showing interest in food. Tricky went round looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. The very next day, an extra bowl was put for him because now the narrator came to know that Tricky was, getting his appetite back. Narrator was happy to see him running towards his bowl. Then he started getting better really quick. He did not require any medicines and started playing with other dogs the whole day. They all used to play with each other, bump into each other, walk over each other, squash each other. All the other dogs accepted him as a family member, although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner and the others were not. He also used to fight for his meals, with his fellow dogs and who were very much larger in size than him. At night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. These were the new things for Tricky. He had never had such a time in his life. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously. She wanted to know more about Tricky. So he was enjoying, all the things. Tricky was enjoying all the things he had not done before. But all this while, what was the condition of Mrs. Pumphrey? Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky. Mr. Harriet used to avoid questions about the coats, beds, etc., which he would ask, but he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering very fast. Then she started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey, wanted Tricky to recover very fast. She started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for Tricky. But Mr. Harriet and his partners, knew that all these eggs were not, they were really harmful for the dog. So what was done with the eggs? The eggs were consumed by the doctor and his partners. Mr. Harriet and his partners would have 2 eggs each for breakfast. Then, to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine for Tricky. Then it became Mr. Harriet's habit to have 2 glasses of wine before lunch and few along with it. We would hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit, the brandy, was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. You know, Mrs. Pumphrey now started sending in brandy for Tricky. At that time, Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. They shared it amongst themselves. Some days Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs, then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and then he would end his day with a brandy in the evening. Because of all these things, they were being sent for Tricky, but Mr. Harriet was really tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest at the surgery because, if he would return Tricky, all these things would stop coming to them. And he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and he really wanted Tricky to go back to Mrs. Pumphrey. So what did he do? He called up Mrs. Pumphrey. He told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was ready to go back home and she should come and pick him up. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her, her lips trembled. Now, within a few minutes, this long black car came outside, where Mrs. Pumphrey was inside the car. When the chauffeur opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, and she was nervous, but she was also excited because she was asking with a nervousness in her voice whether Tricky was really better, and the doctor replied, "Yes, he is fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car." The doctor said, "I'll go and bring Tricky." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. Now, when Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs moving around the garden. Tricky was playing with them. Tricky was sitting between them playing. He had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs. His chest was touching the ground. He had become a very muscular dog within these 2 weeks. And the doctor carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. Tricky saw his mother-like mistress. He was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey, started licking her face, barking in excitement. While all this was happening, the chauffeur and Mr. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car, which had not been used. All these 14 days, all the things which were accompanied by the dog were not used by the staff in the hospital. When Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window and said to Mr. Harriet with tears of joy in her eyes that she could not thank him enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery, meant that the treatment that was given to Tricky had been very successful. So, with this, we come to the end of the chapter and the question answers. We come to the question answers. Question 1 is, what kind of a person do you think the narrator, a veterinary surgeon, is? Would you say he is tactful as well, or full of as well as full of common sense? Now, children, I have given you the solutions. You will not be copying the same answers. You will be using your own words. These solutions are given because we cannot have, a face-to-face discussion. The narrator, veterinary surgeon, is a very sensible, practical, and hardworking doctor who treats his animals with care and love. He is a good and honest man because, although tempted to continue enjoying the luxuries bestowed on him by Mrs. Pumphrey, once the dog recovered, he called her up and told her to take it home. I would say that he is both tactful as well as full of common sense, as he treats the dog with common sense and is tactful in enjoying the pleasures of life during Tricky's stay. He is an excellent vet who can identify and understand the problems of pets immediately and is able to handle their overindulgent owners tactfully. And also, children, he did not use any medication, that also you should mention. His common sense and concern on seeing Tricky's appearance made him realize that the only way to cure the dog was to take him away from his mistress, control his diet and sweets, and give him plenty of exercise. He also enjoyed the eggs, wine, and brandy that was sent by Mrs. Pumphrey. Your question number two is: do you think Tricky was happy to go home? What do you think will happen now? Yes, Tricky was very happy to go back home. When Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from the vet's arms into a tremendous leap and sailed into his lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then, had to defend herself as he licked her face. He was barking. I think the dog would face the same problem again because the mistress was too protective and caring towards her, and she did not realize that her overindulgence and kindness was bad for the dog's health and could even lead to the death of her pet, as she used to overprotect him too much. So all these things, you can write down, you can add your own words to these answers. Question number three is: do you think this is a real life episode or mere fiction, or is it a mixture of both? Children, it is a mixture of both. The wealthy mistress with nothing in life to bother her except the health of her pet dog, whom she overindulges in and spoils, is very true to life. The very practical and dedicated and honest vet who immediately detects the problem and with years of experience is able to handle both the greedy pet and a slightly eccentric mistress are real life situations. However, the luxuries bestowed on the vet for the sake of the dog initially, when the dog had to leave its home, and later, especially when the wine and brandy seemed fictitious, and the sudden recovery of the dog who had reached such a bad state is also a bit, over exaggerated. Thus, one can say that these are the mixture of both. You can add your own views to it. Next, these are the questions, children, you'll have to fare out in your own language. The questions that are mentioned here. This episode describes the silly behavior of a rich woman who is foolishly indulgent, perhaps because she is lonely. Do you think such people are merely silly, or can their actions cause harm to others? This may be because of her loneliness. I have only given you the points. You will elaborate these. They are ignorant about results of their actions. They show their excessive love and affection to someone without knowing the consequences. There is no doubt that their intentions are good and they don't have any sort of ill will, but they are not aware that their action can cause harm to others. Children, you will elaborate this answer in about 100 words. Do you think there are also parents like Mrs. Pumphrey? This is the message that I was talking about when I began the chapter. Yes, there are parents who are too much possessive about their kids. The sense of overindulgence can go in either way. There are examples of parents spoiling their child by meeting each and every demand of the child. To elaborate this answer, children, you can cite examples around about 100 words both. So with this, we come to the end of the